Hello, mental workers. You're listening to the Mental Work Podcast, the podcast about the realities of working in mental health for early career psychologists. As always, I'm your host, Bron Milkins, and today we are talking about the Australian Psychology Board's Training Pathway Redesign proposal. What a mouthful. If you are an early career psychologist, registrar, student, or someone considering the profession, the Psychology Board's proposed training reforms could shape everything from how psychologists are trained to what future career pathways look like. So today we're going to be unpacking what the proposal actually means, what consequences it could have, and how you can have your say before the consultation period closes. Our guest today is Kate Crosher. Hi, Kate.
Hi.
It's so nice to have you on the podcast. Thank you for coming on this important topic. Could you please start us off by telling listeners who you are?
I'm an educational and developmental and a clinical psychologist, and I'm the founding director of AEDPA. That's the Australian Educational and Developmental Psychology Association. So at the moment, I hold the early career portfolio. I'm responsible for providing resources, guidance, advocacy around those who are earlier in their career. For most of my career, I've worked primarily in schools, but I've also worked at regional level for the Education Department in Victoria, supporting allied health professionals. I've also lectured and supervised at tertiary institutions and student clinics. And at the moment, I mostly work in private practice, supervising people at all stages of their career for the registrar program, as well as for CPD, and doing some neurodevelopmental and psychoeducational assessments. I live in far east Gippsland in Victoria. So that's me.
Amazing. What a career. You do a lot of things.
Yep. My fingers in lots of pies.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you're the early career representative as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. The reason why I reached out to the AEDPA in the first place was because you guys have been quite vocal about the pathway redesign proposal, more than I think other people. I've just seen a lot of stuff from you guys. You've been quite active. Why is this?
Well, I think that it's really important for educational and developmental psychologists to have their own voice heard. Our larger organisations have to advocate for the majority, which are generalist psychologists. And we want to make sure that our area of practice doesn't get lost amongst all the noise of what's happening with those early pathways. And nothing changes unless we say something. My colleagues and I started this organisation to say things loudly and proudly and to advocate for the unique competencies that educational and developmental psychologists can bring to our profession. And the training redesign represents that first step a student will take towards becoming a psychologist. So it's important we get this right. When we first saw the redesign, there were a number of things that left us with concern. So we felt it was important to prioritise advocacy in this space so our members and the public could become better informed. And the more people who put in submissions, the more evidence the board has to take to the government so adjustments can be made.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes sense why you guys would have a big stake in this. So for listeners who have seen bits and pieces online but are feeling overwhelmed, can you please give us a plain English overview of what the Psychology Board is proposing and maybe just why these reforms are being considered in the first place?
Absolutely. I'll try and give a bit of an overview as quickly as I can.
Yeah.
Basically, the board has been given a briefing by the government to redesign the pathway for training psychologists. They've been given some clear guidelines around what they have to work with. Primarily, the government wants a single, shorter way to general registration rather than having a 5+1 over here and a 2-year master's in this over there. They want psychologists to be trained quicker. They want to have training that's more consistent with other AHPRA regulated professions. And they want more practical training earlier in the process so psychologists can come out of their training more work ready. And so they're proposing a single 5-year university sequence, and that includes skills training from the second year. And a lot of us would be really excited by that because most of us see our 3-year training and we're like, oh my God, it's all theory, no practice.
Exactly.
So there is definitely some good things about this. Our meetings with the board have found that exactly what this looks like is not yet being spelled out. There are going to be further requirements from the Psychology Accreditation Council, which is APAC, that gives guidelines to training institutions on what exactly this will look like. So there is some flexibility on this. However, ultimately the government wants a clear single 5-year pathway so AHPRA doesn't have to manage all of the different pathways they are at the moment.
Make it tidier, make it neater.
Make it tidier, make it neater. They're comparing to the other AHPRA regulated professions that do have, most of them, a singular pathway. And they want it to be easier and simpler to regulate. And it kind of makes sense. I mean, the reality is that the government always wants things to be easier for them to regulate, cheaper for them to do. If we're being really honest, it makes things less complicated and neater. So in a practical sense, I guess some of the things that this means is they don't want to have a +1 internship. So that would be removed. There would be no more provisional registration for domestic graduates. Now, that was something we were really quite concerned about, but what we found that it doesn't actually mean there's no registration at all for students. That was our original concern. But what it means is that the university can monitor performance during training, and APRA will have a student registration. So that's just like other APRA professions.
Yeah, my understanding with that one is that doctors, for example, have a student registration.
Yeah, and nurses have a student registration. And even teachers, like it's not with APRA, but teachers have a student registration as well.
Yeah.
And so APRA has a backup for supporting universities for any students who perhaps demonstrate some concerning behaviours or have some concerns in their training. But APRA won't be coordinating that in the first instance. And so there will be this introduction of student registration rather than provisional registration. And in fact, the comment that was made to us was that psychologists are over-regulated. By having provisional registration, we actually have more regulation than is necessary. And that was created because we had internships. Long ago, before APRA, certainly in Victoria, we had registration. I believe that not all states had registration, but in Victoria, we had probationary registration. And that was for the 4+2s and then the +1s, when it moved to APRA. But support from a university level as well as APRA provides this double up, I guess, of regulation.
Because I was thinking, why did we have provisional registration in the first place? Because I think we're the only profession that does have it. So that makes sense. It's actually a hangover from when we had that probationary period and we had the internships.
Yeah, exactly. And the +1 as an internship actually was created because there was a lot of backlash about getting rid of the +2 altogether. I've been a psychologist for 25 years. And when I trained and I did my undergrad in the 90s, we knew that the +2 was going to be removed. That's why I chose the 2-year master's program, because I'm like, well, I can't get full registration with the APS if I only have a 4+2. So I might as well do the 6-year master's because I'm going to need it eventually. Anybody who says they didn't know it was going to happen or were going to lose the internships actually just meant that they didn't know it was happening. But it was actually, we've known for a long time. So anyway, back to the current redesign. There are going to be no more psychology exam for domestic pathways because the university will regulate that. And that, again, that reduced the costs for the government. If we're being a bit cynical, government likes things to be cheaper for them. There are also going to be practical placements embedded in the university courses. So moving to that single qualification just opens the door for the profession and things that the profession has needed for a long time. And that just provides things more consistent and equitable. That's the theory.
Yeah. So I guess the proposal is that this will be a one-in-a-generation training reform that will result in more consistent, equitable training costs. It will reduce financial barriers, inequities between pathways, and reliance on limited postgraduate places. Maybe we'll just say before we go into this, I just want to say that this has been confusing for me to understand all of this.
Absolutely, yes.
So as I was saying to you off pod, I'm 9 years registered. So I did my 5+1 in 2017. And I'm finding this so difficult to understand. And I've tried reading it. I've tried understanding, but I'm just finding this so overwhelming.
Yep. And absolutely the same thing. The board in AEDPA is a team of 10. And we have all of our heads getting together and looking at it and reviewing it. And some of us have more time than others. But not all of us understand every little nuance about every part of the new pathway. And it's same as you, 25 years in, and there's some things that I'm like, oh, is that what that means? So it makes sense that early career people will be finding it difficult to understand too. It's
totally
complicated.
The APS actually just released their statement and proposal yesterday.
I saw that too.
And so I downloaded that, and that's 23 pages. And the AEDPA's response is 10 pages as well. So it's there's a lot here. So I actually felt much better yesterday because I was like, Jesus, there is a lot here,
There is a lot here.
Yeah. So let's go into some of the challenges and maybe feasibility that people can try and wrap their heads around. And at the end of the episode, we're also going to go through how they can submit, because that's the aim of this episode. I really want to encourage listeners to make a submission. Your voice is really important, and Kate and I just want to help you be able to do that. So one of the challenges I've had reading the consultation documents is figuring out what the practical implications are. So when you read the proposal, what were the changes that stood out to you as having the biggest impact on students, prov psychs, and early career psychs?
When I had a look at this question last night in preparation, the first thing that actually came to mind was I actually don't think there's going to be very little change for anyone who's currently in training or early career.
Okay.
The short answer is I want to reassure people, I don't think you're going to have a big impact yourselves in the short term. The changes that are currently coming through are really going to impact people who are currently in high school, or perhaps mature age students who've not yet started their psychology training or want to come back. And if history shows anything, it's that the government has to finalise people who are on a specific pathway already. So if you're doing an internship, you will still finish your internship. It took many years for the 4+2 to phase out, and it'll take many years for the 5+1 and the current area of practice 2 years master's programs to phase out too. So it's not going to be a black line drawn, nobody's going to be able to do what they're going to be able to do. If you're currently on a pathway, my prediction would be it's going to continue that way. So don't panic. But it might change things for those people who do want to do a registrar program. If the cutoff for doing it is reached, then things might shift. Of course, we can't predict it, but it might have that implication. In a practical sense, for those who do go through this pathway, the things that will change will be that there will be greater opportunity for people to learn practical skills earlier. So there's going to be no 3-year degree that has no practical counselling skills or other things. You'll learn real stuff from the second year. There is possibility that you'll have to decide that you want to work towards being a psychologist right from the beginning. So for those people who maybe go into a Bachelor of Arts or a Bachelor of Science to test out a few things and then decide, that might be a risk for some people. So that's definitely something to be mindful of. And there are some financial implications potentially for roles that have lower level training. That's the big concern for us. In a feminized workforce with salaries already capped in so many workplaces, this is just another opportunity to limit women's working capacity.
That's something that stood out for me as important as well. I saw the AEDPA say that. I think there was a report that you guys compared it to.
Yeah,
and you were like, look, they're actually saying that we need to benchmark and increase our salaries. And now this AQF potential reform, changing from AQF 9 to 8, might impact our capacity to earn as an 80% feminized workforce.
Yeah, absolutely.
One other thing I wanted to ask you about the practical implications is that, okay, it sounds good to have more practical skills early in the university degree. My question is around funding. I'm just like, will there be more university funding to be able to staff that, to have people do placement coordination? I already know for placement coordinators of postgraduate courses that it is such a challenge to find placements and practical pathways for students. And I'm just like, I don't know how feasible it is to be able to do these practical things earlier in the degree.
And this is something that hasn't been unpacked. This is one of those things that they haven't addressed specifically because the psych board's remit is to provide guidelines to the government on what they recommend the pathway should look like. The implications of what that looks like afterwards is not part of this redesign.
Gotcha. Cool.
So there are going to be a lot of things that are going to need to be thought through. And one of them, and I'm probably jumping ahead a bit, but it seems relevant to say it now. One of them was, as a student on placement, your obligations or your expectations or what people allow you to do is different than what somebody who might be doing in a postgraduate perspective. So one of the ways that as a supervisor, I have been able to argue that the provisional psychologist is able to do things independently is because they are in a postgraduate training pathway. And I can say they're registered as a provisional psychologist and they are at their postgraduate level of training. So they can work independently compared to, and my experience has been in schools and in multidisciplinary teams. Speech pathologists, although they're not APRA regulated, a speech pathology student is very rarely left alone to do things by themselves. A nurse is very rarely left alone to do things by themselves. A doctor is very rarely left alone to do things by themselves. But psychology, by the innate nature of what it is, doing counselling with a client, they often need to be by themselves. And so what are going to be the implications of this? I've had students go into schools independently and work independently and grab kids from the classroom. I'm not there to watch them every single time. We have students out in placements all the time in Victoria doing things by themselves. So there's going to have to be a shift within the workforce around what this looks like if we do have student registration alone. And the professions that we work with are going to have to, and the organisations that we work with are going to have to shift their expectations on what is acceptable, perhaps, in some of these industries.
Yeah, it's like the more we dig into it, the more questions arise about implementation and feasibility. So that's outside the scope of the current reforms. They propose the model, but then the next step would be how do we actually implement it?
How do we actually implement it?
Yeah.
So there's the first step to propose the model. Second step is implementation. We also then have APAC coming in. So APAC is the Australian Psychology Accreditation Council, and they are the ones who will create the competencies, and they'll create what the training pathways require. So this project isn't going to unpack all of the little nuances. This is the first step. This then gets to the government. The government still has to accept it. They might decide they don't want and don't like certain things in this proposal. So there's lots of layers and lots of steps from behind the scenes that we don't always get to see.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as we mentioned earlier, there is a proposal for the single 5-year pathway to general registration. Are there any benefits to that change? And are there any other concerns about implementation that the AEDPA have?
Good question. I think that a single 5-year pathway, and what the AEDPA thinks, is that it has lots of potential to streamline the training for psychologists in general. So that will mean that we'll all come out as true generalists. There's no competitiveness between different areas of endorsement, and we don't want to get too political here, but let's be honest, professional pathways versus area of practice pathways, clinical versus everyone else. There's a lot of competitiveness and variable opinions about a lot of that. So this has definitely a real chance to level the playing field for all of us.
I like that because I think like having come into this profession almost 10 years ago now, I feel like I came into like a volcano. I guess I just noticed that there was a lot of competition, or people had varying views about the merits of different pathways and of the people who were trained in those pathways. And I just wanted us all to get along. I've talked about it on the podcast how like that was quite a naive view, but I would love a pathway to unite us, and so we could have that collegiality.
Yeah, and I think if we all came out the same and then made the choice to go into what pathway we wanted to, there's definitely some merit in that.
Yeah.
There's an excess of clinical training pathways. There's too many clinical psychologists. Clinical psych, by its nature, is supposed to be hospital-based complex mental health. 25 years ago when I trained, I feel myself going back in my day, but 25 years ago, that's what it was. I didn't want to be a clinical psychologist because that felt too scary. But, and having trained and supervised many clinical psychs over the last 10 years, they don't necessarily want to do this work. Many choose clinical psychology because they've been told it's better. It's a great pathway and it's necessary and it's an important part of our field, but it's not the only one and it's not necessary in many settings. So I really do think that this has the chance of really making things more level.
Are there any concerns about the single 5-year pathway?
I think that the way that it's worded on the image, and if you're wondering, there is the image of what the pathways look like, and it says Bachelor of Psychological Science or something like it. Bachelor of Professional Psychology.
Yes.
If you think of it as an undergraduate bachelor, as we've alluded to, there's the AQF level, the Australian Qualifications Framework level, that reduces the level from a 9 to an 8. So that's a particular thing, and we can go in that a little bit more a bit later. But the other things that we've been thinking about is a single 5-year pathway where you have to decide from the get-go that you're going to be a psychologist means that someone will finish high school and maybe a generalist psychologist fully registered by the time they're 23. This is pretty young. Like, are 23-year-olds ready for this kind of complex work across the lifespan? I'm not saying they're not. I remember myself at 23, but this is something to think about when we know adolescence goes up to 25.
I started university when I was 16, actually. So the thought of me picking to be a psychologist when I was 16, I'm just like, no.
Crazy, right? And then you've alluded to this earlier around, do we have employment pathways that will provide the learning opportunities and career structure for these young psychologists? There's going to need to be a shift in the workplace. Sometimes people can't do things alone. So we're going to need to really think about expectations from employers and organisations.
So I've got 2 concerns. So I do want to talk further about the AQF, and then I want to talk about the international comparison, actually, because I was reading the APS very briefly last night, and they had concerns about our international standing as well. So let's talk first about the AQF 9 to 8. So my understanding with AQF 9 is that is benchmarked to a master's degree. And then AQF 8 is benchmarked to a bachelor with an honours year. So kind of just one step above a bachelor's. Fourth year. Yeah. So can you just tell us why this distinction matters? Why should we care?
It's unheard of for a salary level to drop. AQF 9 and having a certain training at master's level tends to equal the level of income that you will make when you exit. Now, I don't want it to be all about money because that's not the be all and end all of everything. The AQF level also is about competency that you will developed within that period of time. And there are implications for PhD level training for those who might want to move into academia. If they only have a level 8, then that's not going to actually help. But they need that level 9 to be able to move into PhD. So how will universities get students working towards these higher degrees where they're not embedded in the training pathway as easily? Sure, a lot of psychs aren't interested in research, but it is a core competency of psychology. It does distinguish us from other professions. The scientist practitioner model is a really important part of how we operate. And most importantly, we need good researchers to be teaching our courses. Without a good pathway into PhD, we risk losing quality lecturers and professors. So I think that's a big part of it. But I'll come back to the Fair Work Commission and standards for paying professionals, because that's probably our main concern, one of the significant concerns as a very feminised workforce. The Fair Work Commission has set the standards for paying professionals. They have their awards based upon psychologists being qualified at AQF level 9. So that's in direct disagreement with what the government is now proposing. Now, the thing is, it's unheard of for professions to go backwards. And again, without wanting to wave the feminist flag too strongly, we know that female-dominated professions tend to reduce salary over time and they have a ceiling. And this just feels like another example of that. My understanding is that in 2025, there was a gender under evaluation review, and the Commission proposed aligning the HPSS award classification structure directly to these AQF levels. And it treats a psychologist as AQF level 9. That's the master's degree level. And that's the highest professional tier in that structure. So for example, in comparison, a physiotherapist sits at AQF 7. And a lot of the other professions sit at AQF 7 in APRA. And this is where the government comes in terms of their expectations or what they've given, their guidelines, what they've given to the psych board. They actually wanted the psych board to do AQF level 7, just a bachelor degree.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. When we heard that, we had a meeting with the psych board just last week, and that was a really interesting thing that they shared with us. And so the board went back and did do some advocacy for us, which is really great to hear, and said that's not acceptable. We can't do level 7 for psychologists. That's not appropriate. That's not reasonable. We need to have it higher than that. And they pushed as hard as they can, but the government agreed to level 8. So the level 8 is already a bit of a compromise from the government's point of view. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't advocate for 9, and it doesn't mean that we should stop pushing that in our submission, and we have pushed that in our submission. But perhaps we have a little bit more understanding of how hard it will be to push the government from where they want to be and where we currently are. And this is where politics and bureaucracy and stuff is in play. And sometimes when you are working in these kind of spaces, you have to find a way of compromising and finding a way to make the best out of a bad situation. Love it or like it.
Yeah, I find this one really difficult because from what I'm hearing, it sounds like the government is saying to us, look, we can produce a good psychologist at AQF 8. Why do we need a really good psychologist at 9 when we can get a standard one at 8? So I guess they think that safety can be upheld with 8 and like competence. Is that kind of the impression you're getting?
Yeah, they think that you can get all of what psychologists need to learn in this level 8 with a 5-year pathway. Like, I tend to be the eternal optimist, and this is not an AEDPA position, but I tend to be an eternal optimist personally. And so I just feel if we had to make the best of a bad situation, we probably could. If we're squishing in all of those electives you do in undergrad, and if we squished them up and we had less electives and more psychology-focused training, which I think would be a great idea, maybe we can actually get further in that 5 years with an AQF level 8. But the biggest thing that drops is this research component.
Yeah. That's concerning to me because if listeners are not aware, like lecturers, most of them to be employed as a lecturer, you need a PhD qualification.
Yeah, you need to have a higher level of qualification than the course you are teaching, or at least the same. So I don't have a PhD. I do teach at universities. I can teach up to master's level, but I couldn't supervise PhDs.
Gotcha.
PhD and doctorate trained lecturers can teach everything, basically. So a master's level could teach an undergraduate. I guess in theory, if you had a bachelor, you could teach in a bachelor, but tends to be people at master's level teaching in all of them. at least in our industry.
It does concern me, I guess. So like I have a PhD and I work as a researcher, and I find it very valuable, and obviously, hindsight bias as well. Like I wouldn't want to say like, oh, I wasted my life. So I'm like, yeah, it's a good choice.
We all love our own pathway.
Yeah, exactly. So I do find it very valuable. On the other hand, I have found that employers have not really cared that I have more research.
No.
So I have been told explicitly, like, you're not being paid more because you have it. You don't use it in your practice.
Little do they know,
Yeah.
right? Little do they know how much you actually use.
Yeah, I would say I use
research.
it every day in my psychological practice. I'm using it. I'm thinking about how to craft this, how to test hypotheses, create hypotheses. Can I consult the research literature? What does it say here? What are the gaps? How can I apply that to my practice? So I do think research is incredibly important. So it does make me a little bit sad that we may lose that potential pathway.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think that a research component to our training is such an important part that's undervalued by a lot of us early in our career. And I was very clear. I don't want to be a researcher. I don't want to do this, but I'll do it because I really want to be a psychologist. And people who don't work in psychology or don't understand psychology, a lot of them are the ones making these decisions. And they're like, what do you need to do that to be a counselor? They equate psychology with counseling, and that's what they think that we're doing. And we're not. We're doing more than that. We're synthesizing and analyzing so much information. We're not just sitting there listening to people and helping them process their feelings. That's part of what we do, but we are more than that. And reducing the AQF level has definitely the risk of reducing the competency and the extensiveness of what we learn, alongside potentially reducing our minimum award 19 to 31% reduced, which will impact on super, which will impact on other things. Okay, we'll start work a year earlier, so we perhaps get a year more work, but there's definitely some risks in all of that.
Yeah, I agree. I find this quite persuasive. Like if I was to make a submission, and I know I've tested the AEDPA.
We make the submission.
I will make the submission. And
Yep.
I tested the AEDPA submission generator, and you can pick your positions and you don't have to select them all. And I would pick the AQF one as the focus for me. I tried to think of an example of this. And one of the things that I came up with how important research is was I remember quite early on when I was doing my 5+1 internship, my employer said to me, you need to deliver emotion regulation strategies to autistic kids that you are seeing. And at the time, there is no such thing as emotion regulation therapy. Like there's no EMT for autistic kids. So I'm trying to think, how do I deliver? Like, am I just picking and choosing little strategies? And is that a cohesive therapy? And is this something evidence-based that I can offer to my autistic kids? And is this safe? And is this effective? So for me, I feel like if I didn't have research brain, I would have been like, I just pick and choose window of tolerance. And then I do a bit of like blue zone and green zone, and then I'm all good. And that'll help my autistic kids. But I don't find that very satisfactory. And I think that speaks to why research and our science test practitioner focus is very important, because autistic kids deserve better too.
Absolutely. And I think that distinguishes us from other professions.
Yeah.
If we didn't have that, and with all due respect to the other professions that I'm about to label, of course, because they're great in what they do, but if we didn't have that, then we might as well just be a teacher.
Yeah.
If we didn't have that, we might as well be one of these other professions, because a teacher can pull out window of tolerance, a teacher can pull out some social skills training, and they'll do a fine job. But they won't necessarily have that next step of being able to look into the research and work out what's actually evidence-based and look at the client and actually figure out what that client needs in the context of everything else going on around them. And, that's across the lifespan. A nurse can do a great job of this stuff. Anybody can pick up these tools and do it. A parent can do it. But without our training the way that we are trained, they don't have the same ability to look at that information. And I think that is such an important part of why we have concerns around this. Now, having said that, as I said, it is possible that this is something that's a done deal, that we haven't got any power over. We should still say something, because the more we say something, the more maybe the government will listen. But in that case, one of the things that AEDPA has shifted in the way that we are going to put our proposal together is to actually talk about, if there is a shift to AQF level 8, what should that look like? And what should we make sure still exists in our training pathway to ensure that it is adequate for purpose to build the competency of psychologists? So when you are making a submission, if there are things that we need to sometimes we just need to suck up changes, right? If there are things we need to suck up and just deal with, then putting in some ideas about what you think. If you insist on having AQF level 8, this is what you should do, and this is what we need to make sure happening. Then that's a good way perhaps to compensate for some things that we just don't have any power to control or change. It's not our ideal, but we are trying to be realistic and acknowledge that there might be limited changes we can make in that or advocate for. So we're trying to perhaps hedge our bets both ways. We want this, but if we have to have this, this is what we want it to look like.
Yep, that makes sense. One of the other areas that listeners might be interested in is our areas of practice endorsement. So currently psychology has 8 areas of practice endorsement. And so the proposal includes changes to registrar programs and the idea of industry-accredited workplaces. So after 5 years, we're all generally registered psychologists, and then it's driven by the workplace, and there will be these accredited workplaces where you can work for 1 or 2 years and then gain your endorsement. What are the potential risks and opportunities? When I saw this, I was like, is this going to be the death of everything but clinical?
It's definitely something to be concerned about, I guess, isn't it? In the first instance, the areas of practice endorsement is due to have its own review soon. So once the training pathways are done, areas of practice will be also reviewed and will be considered alongside, I guess, what they've already decided on the training pathway. It's very likely that areas of practice endorsement will change anyway, with or without this change in the way it's being trained, because we just have some areas of practice endorsement, very unfortunately, that just don't have the numbers for it to be sustainable. And the areas of practice endorsement were really simply decided upon the way that the APS had its structure of interest area groups, so the colleges. And that was the literal extent of the thought that was put into it. So it is really good for us to have a review on what areas of practice endorsement might look like. Now, we're all a little bit scared and we all have passion about our own areas of practice endorsement for those of us who are endorsed. But I think there is something really exciting about that idea of this. Again, it's once in a lifetime way of reviewing what's happening. It's a once in a lifetime chance. So we have a definite possibility here for things to be good. Having said that, the risk to industry-based workplaces is that they are not necessarily going to provide the breadth of training that endorsement does. Having a workplace that is linked to your title and your professional title means that the workplace dictates what you do as a professional. And workplaces have their own motives for what they teach. And the things that they want psychologists to know. That's not independent learning. That's biased for their settings. And that's really risky as psychologists, because as psychologists, one of the things we learn about is confirmation bias. So we want to make sure that things are developed so the public gets the service they need, rather than the industry dictating what they want psychologists to do. An industry-accredited workplace will risk shaping training around the priorities of that employer or that commercial setting, rather than broad transferable skills that endorsements meant to address. So that's going to narrow a psychologist's clinical exposure and maybe entrench these setting-specific practices over evidence-based standards. And for example, having worked in the Victorian Education Department for some years, a job that I really, really enjoyed and found I learnt a lot in, you can definitely see people changing their practice because of what the government wants in the way that they want assessments done. So we use funding, for example. The way that the funding is applied in a school setting, or the way the NDIS funding applies, changes the way we write reports. We're not now doing an assessment to assess what this client needs broadly and to provide a label and a diagnosis or identify a neurotype for somebody because of what's actually happening for the client. We're impacted by whether or not this particular diagnosis will create funding, whether we like it or not. And I don't mean that to be controversial. And I'm not saying these diagnoses are not real. They absolutely are. I'm just saying that we don't realize how impacted we are by the way an industry and a government creates the rules around things. So there's definitely danger in our professional autonomy, our ethical decision-making, and client interests becoming secondary to the organizational or governmental objectives. And that erodes our independence and consistency of standards.
Yeah.
On the flip side, there are some really good opportunities for collaborations. And I know Western Australia has a really great school psych program.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, there's Anne Lord over there. She does an amazing job.
Yeah, she does.
There's definitely some great collaborations that could occur in medical settings that could work well, and maybe even NDIS and other bits and pieces. So There's definitely possibilities. However, I really believe that the endorsement program and being a registrar and being endorsed is more than just the skills of a workplace. So, for example, although I identify as a school psychologist, my identity as an ed and dev is not only about schools. And I see school psych as different to educational psych. Endorsement has these unique competencies and experiences that are not specific to a workplace, and they should be separate. And that allows for a much broader and more extensive skill set.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, some opportunities, but also some concerns. As you were talking, I was just reflecting my own experience of working in a private hospital. And a lot of it, unfortunately, is just driven by share prices.
Yes, share prices,
funding.
money. Yeah, absolutely.
And it's like,
about money.
If we've got bums on seats, we don't mind what therapy you deliver to the clients as long as they're in there and we can get the health insurers to pay. And that's not controversial. That's just reality.
It's just reality.
So I'm like, I just wouldn't like it if it was, I guess, if we were more constrained or there was difficulties with being able to do what's best for the patient in front of us.
And the standard setting in an organization is that things reflect what's convenient to deliver rather than what's clinically ideal. For example, and this may be controversial and there's a whole podcast on this, but in private hospitals where nurses are supporting new mums into breastfeeding or not breastfeeding, it is based upon reducing the risk to the hospital. It is not necessarily based upon what the mum wants to do. And so women don't get the advice that they want to feel confident in their decisions around whether they want to breastfeed. Most women go in wanting to breastfeed, but many women don't because they don't get the right supports. And that's not criticizing women who end up formula feeding, because you do what you need to do.
Yep.
And it is better that you are healthy and happy and connected. That's fine. But when most women want to breastfeed and yet many don't, it means that they are not getting the support that's required to achieve their own goals. And that's based upon the organizational demands and the risk that organization is willing to take, which may be different to what the person wants, the client wants.
Absolutely. So, Kate, if a listener is thinking, I'm only a student, registrar, or an early career psychologist, surely my opinion does not matter, what would you say to them? Why is it important that they engage in this consultation process?
I would say that right now it might feel like it doesn't matter, but by the time it does go through, you will have more experience. You'll be the one supervising the early career psychologists, and you'll be wanting to make sure that you're working with people who have the skills and the competencies to be effective practitioners. Your voice actually does count. Your voice counts more than mine. Your opinion is exactly what's needed. You've got a long career left. You'll be the ones dealing with the fallout down the track if they get this wrong.
Very persuasive. So for people who want to make a submission before the 10th of June deadline, what's the practical steps they can take? And how can they use tools like the AEDPA submission generator to make the process less intimidating?
So the first step, of course, is to get onto the IPRA website, have a look at all the resources. If you don't have time, you can just use something like the submission generator or your own other professional organization tools. Check out the resources, their performance to follow that you can put your information in. It is vital, however, that you're not basing submissions on misinformation. So don't rely on random people making controversial statements on social media. If you put anything in your submission that is inaccurate information, they cannot include your submission at all. That was what we were told last week.
Oh, interesting. Okay,
so
good to know.
Make sure that you are not using misinformation to provide your response. You can respond to everything, or you can just respond to small parts. If you don't understand it all and you don't want to make a comment on that part, don't worry. Don't put it in. Just respond to the bits you know. Every little bit counts. They'll put it all together. They'll take it all on board. And, in the end, it's really just the performers all exist. And then there's our submission generator where you go in, you choose the bits that you agree with or don't, if you don't agree with it, don't choose it. And it'll just pop out a nice little thing for you to send in.
Yeah, I quite liked it. As I said, I was playing around with it yesterday and I thought it was very sensible and well written.
And listen, most of the professional associations do have a document of some sort that you could use to inform your submission. But certainly I like ours, of course.
Yeah, I thought it was really great. Kate, thank you so much for coming on. I think this has been really informative and I think it'll be really helpful for listeners. Is there anything else that you want them to take away most from today?
I think that it's so important that we need to understand we can't sit back and say nothing. Psychologists tend to be quiet and agreeable and understanding, but without noise, action just doesn't happen. So join your professional associations and help them do the work that they need to do. And here's my little advertising spiel. We have membership categories for generalists as well as ed and devs. All are welcome. We're all volunteers just carving out a small window of time in our busy weeks to get these messages out there. And we'd love to have more people involved in advocacy. So making your own submissions, using our generator if you don't have time to do anything else, just get something out there and get your voice heard. Don't be passive. If you just get something in, things need to be said. Even if you agree with the changes, that needs to be said too. We don't want everything to be disagreeing. So share what you liked about it as well as what you didn't like about it. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity to have your opinion heard.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kate. I really appreciate your clarity and thoroughness.
No problem.
And as I said, I think listeners will find it really helpful. I'll make sure I put all those links in the show notes. So I'll put a link to the AEDPA and your submission generator, and I'll put a link to your submission document as well.
Awesome.
Listeners, if you found today's episode helpful, make sure that you share it with a colleague who needs to hear it so that they can be more informed too. And you can also follow the Mental Work podcast and leave a rating and review. And that's a wrap. Thanks so much for listening to Mental Work. I'm Bron and catch you next time. Bye.